Okay, so it is 4 p.m. On my computer, and I think we shall start this event today. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon from Singapore. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Aisha Al-Sarihi. I'm a research fellow at the Middle East Institute here at the National University of Singapore. And I'm very delighted to be hosting today's panel discussion. Today, we will talk about hydrogen. As we know, many countries around the world have turned to hydrogen for energy security, economic, as well as environmental reasons. From environmental perspective, specifically, as the global community to strive to, to keep the 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming within reach and achieve net zero emissions by 2050, clean hydrogen is viewed as a form of clean fuel that can decarbonize hard-to-abate sectors. These sectors that cannot be decarbonized by the available technology, such as the heavy transport, shipping, aviation, and heavy industry like the steel and chemical industry. And today we see a growing enthusiasm towards hydrogen development. As of today, there are more than 15 countries globally that have announced national hydrogen strategies. These include countries from Southeast Asia. Specifically, it is Singapore, who released its national hydrogen strategy last year ahead of COP27. And from the Middle East, the UAE, the host of COP28, has actually a few weeks ago also released its national hydrogen strategy. Other countries are also embarking on hydrogen initiatives, setting targets, or signing memorandum of understanding to accelerate the hydrogen production, use, and export. For example, Saudi Arabia have announced a big green hydrogen plant to be developed in NEOM. And a few weeks ago, we heard that new NEOM Green Hydrogen Company completed the financial close for this project. Also, in April this year, Oman awarded the first land blocks for 6 hydrogen projects, and the International Energy Agency has released a report focusing on the hydrogen potential in Oman and suggesting that Oman can be one of the biggest hydrogen exporters by 2030. If we look at the Southeast Asia, almost all of the Southeast Asian nations are currently exploring the hydrogen production, use, and export. However, the dilemma today, if we look at the hydrogen production currently, it is dominated by the hydrogen production from hydrocarbon resources, from natural gas, from oil and coal. And the hydrogen that is coming from renewable energy, it's actually accounting for only 1% of total hydrogen output today. And this is challenging because for the global community to reach net zero by 2050, according to the International Energy Net Zero report, the clean hydrogen production needs to be increased from current level 6 times from its current levels today. And if we look at the hydrogen market today, we see that hydrogen production and utilization is already taking place in some countries. However, in terms of the clean hydrogen is not a traded commodity today, apart from the demonstrative ships that we have seen. So the gap between where we are today and where we need to be in the future is still substantial. Therefore, in this webinar, we want to look very closely at this growing enthusiasm to develop the hydrogen And we would like to ask the question, is hydrogen more of a hype than opportunity? And in today's webinar, we will look closely at the hydrogen development in Southeast Asia, as well as the Middle East. So to go through this webinar and to ask the question of whether hydrogen is more of a hype than opportunity, I'm very delighted to be joined by distinguished speakers who have expertise on hydrogen development in both Southeast Asia and the Middle East. And I'm delighted to be joined today from Singapore. We have Dr. David Broadstock, who is an economist with around 15 years of experience, most of which is in Asia. David is a senior research fellow and a head of the Energy Economics Division with the Energy Studies Institute here at the National University of Singapore. He's also a research affiliate with the Sustainable and Green Finance Institute at the university. From Jakarta, I'm joined by Mr. Mohammed Shadir, who is a senior officer at the Energy Modeling and Policy Planning Department in the ASEAN Center for Energy. He is currently also involved in ASEAN Climate Change and Energy Project as a senior research analyst. And from Oman, we have Dr. Abdullah Al-Abri, who is a consultant at the International Energy Agency, focusing on sustainability, technology, and investments. Before joining the IEA, Dr. Abdullah worked in the energy industry in the GCC and Australia, focusing on project development and corporate planning. Before we kick off the discussion today, I would like to remind everyone who is joining us that if you have any questions, please feel free to post them on the chat box for the MEI event or to me directly. And we will try to answer those questions in the Q&A session. With that, I would like to kick off the webinar today with Dr. David. And I would like to pose the question that we have in the title of this webinar. Is hydrogen more hype than opportunity? I'll give the floor to you, Dr. David.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. First of all, it's a pleasure to be a part of this panel. I'm sure it's going to be a very engaging discussion that we'll have between us. Should just share my slides with the audience. Okay, can I just confirm that you can see these okay?
Yes, yes.
Okay, excellent. So thank you for having me join this. I'm just sitting just around the corner from yourself, but not from the rest of the colleagues on the panel. So I'm looking forward to an engaging discussion. And I decided to target the question quite directly. And in 12 minutes or so, I'm just going to try and give you my quick take on the question about hydrogen. Is it more hype than opportunity? It's already been mentioned that my background is as an economist, and I'll talk around the slides. You'll find that there's more words than I'll run through, and I'll try to make a version of these slides available to you. But the highlights, what does this mean if I'm an economist? Well, first of all, I believe that markets are usually a good way to coordinate economic activity. But I also appreciate that markets do not necessarily always work automatically. And the reason that they don't necessarily work automatically is because we have uncertainty, and uncertainty persists in both supply and demand sides of the market. And uncertainty is very much an issue when it comes to hydrogen markets. And I'm going to play through just a few thoughts with you as to what it is that I pay attention to when it comes to hydrogen markets. But it all begins with a story of understanding as well. Where are we in relation to energy markets in their totality? And there's been a lot of change recently. So the first point I want to try to put across is that energy-related risk has structurally reconfigured, and I'll try to elaborate briefly on what I mean. So we've been presented within the past 2 to 3 years with a sequence of shocks. We had COVID, which disrupted energy markets. It created a calamity towards energy demand in terms of the significant contraction that we had to undergo. And supply chains shrunk accordingly over time as these demand shocks persisted. This created a consequence to price. And one thing we know for sure is that significant changes to price, they add definition to markets. And we can certainly see that, what I'm going to argue is that we've seen such a significant shift in price uncertainty that markets have fundamentally redefined. Now, maybe I'll skip through this slide in the interest of time, but were I to try to say that I try to look to markets with a technical lens and observe the data and see whether or not there's changing consequences. The graph on the left, and the very primitive interpretation on this, tells me that the way in which the global economy was impacted by a shock in energy prices, here proxied by the Brent crude price, rose from by an order of magnitude of about 3 to 4 times, 300 to 400% growth in the scale of impact. Just take that as a kind of defensible conclusion. And the graph to the right, this is part of my own analysis, which actually tries to demonstrate that not only did we see a big change in the way that the markets operated, but that up until just 2 months ago, we don't see a clear reversal. Now, if you wish for more detail on these graphs, I'll happily unpack that in a different seminar. But my point is that I can clearly see that COVID restructured things, and there's seemingly no way backwards from those impacts at the moment. Not to a state that we can think that we're back to pre-COVID market conditions. And I'll make that all make sense, why we care about that in just a minute. One thing we've also seen is that energy geopolitics has re-emerged with some vigor. In recent years, we've seen OPEC beginning to renew its status as a potential influencer of oil prices. And I know we're talking about hydrogen today, but hydrogen is increasingly important when we have high oil prices, high gas prices, high coal prices. It creates a different demand for these things. And so we're certainly seeing that OPEC is one side of the story where we're seeing a renewed attempt to influence market prices through some kind of strategic sway. And then at the same time, I'm increasingly aware that countries like China are beginning to hold power over global markets. This particular graph, again, I'm sorry, it's a little bit technical, but there's a very fundamental story. If I'm to try to draw what I think to be a relatively clever picture of how the uncertainty within the markets has evolved in recent years, then what this graphic tells me is that from all the way back until 2010, up until just before COVID, 2019, 2020, there was one level of market uncertainty. Of course, in 2020, we expect that to spike, and we see that in the data. But what's interesting is that the black line, you see that it does rise after 2020, and then it does not show signs of reversal, even up until today. So this, for me, is an important undertone, that we have been facing a structure of risk within markets, and we certainly recognize that things changed due to the sequence of events that we had. The COVID conditions, the global energy crunch which followed that, and then the interactions between Russia and Ukraine, which impacted global commodity markets in very powerful ways. So we recognize this. There's a risk which we've felt, and a risk which has changed and does not seem to be reversing. And then from Singapore's perspective, we suffer a similar problem with many other countries insofar as we have to import certain components of our fuel, our energy. And this creates important dependencies. And then from our particular perspective, we've seen that the risks which are presented to us as an energy importer have reconfigured structurally. They're not reversing. The second point I wish to make is that, very clear, I think, for everybody in this audience, despite the risk situation, the scenario we're in, we do need to transition to a net zero emissions power sector and economy. Pathways are required, and we're taking efforts to advance this. In terms of where Singapore's discussion has been, and I'll concentrate a tiny bit on Singapore given my experience, we've quickly accelerated within 5 years from a discussion that was kind of in the not zero kind of consideration. We weren't committed to making net zero at a specific point in time just 5 years ago. But 5 years later, here we are, and net zero is something that we target by the same timeframes as all of our peers, and we're doing the best that we can to accelerate this. And we're introducing a range of different mechanisms. That's the key point from this story, that actually policy is evolving very rapidly. The complication with this is that we're not necessarily very clear on what the actual development pathways are. And scenarios have been considered by the market authorities, and we can see 3 particular courses of action which might make sense. To pursue a clean energy-based system, which would have maybe a 30% share of hydrogen, to pursue what we call a climate action block, where the role of hydrogen is maybe 15% or so, 10 to 15%, or an emergent trailblazer, an emergent technology trailblazer, where the possible share of hydrogen exceeds 50%. Now, there's 2 points to this. We don't know where the role of hydrogen truthfully sits within the future fuel mix of the economy, but one thing is clear: we're not conceiving a scenario where hydrogen is not a piece of the puzzle. So there is a lot of hype behind hydrogen. What can we state about the hype behind hydrogen? I like to think of it in a TRL5 perspective. TRL refers to the technological readiness level, and the graph on the right indicates something about the technological readiness level scale. But in brief, we would expect a technology to be getting to the point of about TRL 7 to 9 to be where it is self-sustaining, commercially viable. Where we are today is that hydrogen is a fuel which has some demonstrated cases that appear to support commercial viability, but not a marketplace that gives everybody confidence that we're there. We're on the cusp of commercialization, but we're not quite there yet. If we turn towards market sentiment, what do we understand about where things have gone in the past 2 years? I think probably many of us recognize that we've been talking about hydrogen fuel for quite a period of time. What you see on the screen here is a graph which depicts what's known as an exchange-traded fund, a fund that is traded on the financial markets, which is intended to reflect the value of hydrogen as a commodity. And so this graph illustrates that between 2021 up until just a few weeks ago, the value of the hydrogen commodity chain has maybe decreased by around 60%. Now, we should take those numbers with a high degree of caution. There's many caveats that we need to push behind this. But the core message is actually very clear. The market itself is of the view that the value proposition behind hydrogen as a commodity has been in decline in recent years. Yet we're still in a situation where, because of fuel security, energy security, we're pursuing hydrogen as an option. And this graph presents a similar finding. It says, well, let's look at the broader economic benefits that we might see within a hydrogen economy. But we see that expectations there have also mapped into a decline. So is it just hype? Have we just had a lot of hype that has now been put to rest, that we've had a significant discussion around the importance of hydrogen, but truthfully speaking, it seems like the value proposition has been left behind? I tend to think not. I tend to hold on to this idea that we really are on a cusp, and we're on a necessary cusp. Hydrogen within the Singapore context continues to be actively explored, and the details I'll leave you to follow up through afterwards. But we're in a situation where we're being forced to build out new gas-based power generation facilities because, like many other economies, we're not in a position where we can scale up solar. We're not in a position where we can push many of the other alternative technologies that we might look towards. But hydrogen seems to be something that we can tap into because you can, in the short term, blend hydrogen together with natural gas. And then in the long term, more easily retrofit some of those natural gas solutions. Now, to add a bit of additional context, what seems to be happening is that we are pursuing the idea that that hydrogen is an industry that is on the cusp of being commercially viable and carries strategic importance to us. And then we need to realize that it's not at all uncommon that we, government planners, let's say, will nurture infant industries in order to facilitate the potential growth of those strategically important sectors. And I believe that's what we're seeing in the context of hydrogen within Singapore at the moment. And it's not an unreasonable objective. And if it works, it will provide also the advantage of being a first mover into the hydrogen market and potentially acting in some ways as a hub within the region, which is something to consider. Okay, so I'm going to just close up, remind ourselves on what at least I think are important messages to think about with hydrogen. Is hydrogen more hype than opportunity? Well, I think the following are minimally true. That there has been a risk that's evolved within energy markets as a whole, which causes us to need to pay attention to those on the cusp technologies. That we also need to identify on the cusp technologies that have the potential to achieve net zero pathways, and the right versions of hydrogen will do that. There is a lot of hype between hydrogen, but this is not the same as a fad type of hype. This has some different foundations. It's a hype which is grounded in the reality that it may be a necessary pathway, at least not to exclude and potentially commit to very seriously. And then preconditioning all of this, because of point one, the structural reconfiguration and market risk, we must question whether holding out for a return to normal market conditions as we imagine they might occur may not actually happen, and we may need to force the hand of markets to help find new supply chains. So we cannot dismiss the hype in hydrogen. It's not fad type, it's something different. And whilst some of the market participants are looking for opportunity, others are turning towards hydrogen as a matter of necessity and strategic importance. In the spirit of trying my best to keep within time, I will close my opening remarks there. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much, David, and thanks for sticking to the 12 minutes time, as I suggested, and thanks also to being right to the point on answering my question. As you said, hydrogen at the moment is, there's a lot of hype behind the hydrogen. However, because there are structural risks in the market, hydrogen and the energy transition is a necessity. With that, I would like now to move to Mr. Mohammed to give us an overview of the hydrogen development in Southeast Asia, and if you can speak about also what are the drivers behind hydrogen uptake in Southeast Asia. Mohammed, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Aisha. Let me do this search. Hope you can see my share screen. Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for NUS and organizer for inviting me on this webinar on how hype is hydrogen in Southeast Asia. So before answering about this one, I would like to present about our current analysis on the hydrogen development in the Southeast Asia itself, and particularly for the potential for hydrogen in ASEAN itself. Yeah, we are working in ASEAN Center for Energy is guided by our plan of action, or called the APAI, ASEAN Plan of Action for Energy Corporations, in which it is highlighting 7 program areas, including the renewable energies. And one of the activities that we are looking or working on is also hydrogen as the promising technology or emerging technology that we consider in the near futures. So we also have the an analysis about what will be the energy supply and demand in the future in ASEAN, and our recent publications on the ASEAN Energy Outlook named the 7 ASEAN Energy Outlook, which is highlighted what will be the energy supply and demand for Southeast Asia from 2020 until 2050. And what you can see here that on our analysis, by applying different scenarios, you can see here that by only applying the baseline scenario, that the total final energy consumptions will be tripled in 2050 compared to 2020. So if we are doing nothing, it seems that we need more generate a lot of energy than as expected. And but if we are also applying another scenarios, but it seems also that the energy consumption is increasing, but it is likely increasing not as much as we are doing nothing on the baseline scenario. So how to handle this final energy consumption in the future, which is predicted to be triple in the 2050? And one of our considerations is also about the energy technology, such as the hydrogen, and also another technologies such as CCS, and also implementing renewable energy. And based on our another analysis, that you can see here that the total power capacity in 2020 across the Southeast Asian nations is dominated by Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam, in which those 3 countries accounted for around 2/3 of the total capacity. And if you can see here, the installed capacity of power, installed power capacity in ASEAN by source in 2020, it is still generated mostly by fossil fuel. It is noted that the coal and gas and also hydropower contributed more than 80% of the installed power capacity. And on the additional ASEAN installed power capacity in 2020, if we compare to 2019 by source, it can be seen that the solar PV is the highest additional installed power capacity in 2020, in which it is the first installed by the solar, and then followed by hydropower. And seeing that background that the energy consumption is increasing year by year, and also we are still dominated by the fossil fuel, and majority by coal and oil. So in ASEAN, we are also thinking what other emerging technologies that we would like to develop further. And one of them is the hydrogen energy for Southeast Asia. Because of that, then one of our recent publication is also analyzing on the hydrogen potential in Southeast Asia. And in year 2022, we have launched the hydrogen in ASEAN from economics prospect, development, and its applications. Then what we can see from the reports, we started by analyzing why ASEAN is the hydrogen itself. As you might already know, the hydrogen is the result based to develop indigenous hydrogen productions, such as the green, gray, blue engines. As also it is could be coupled with renewable energy and as the future clean energy supply and energy storage. And it's also could be applicable not only for industrial sector, but also for creating sustainable road transport. Yeah, this is if we one of our finding that this is only Singapore which has the national hydrogen strategy compared to another ASEAN member states. Singapore has the first country that have highlighting what are the strategy to develop the national hydrogen strategies. From their analysis, you can see here this is the applications of the hydrogens that can be applied in Southeast Asia, ranging from the productions and then to the transportation, and can be used in in any activities, including power generations, fuel for fuel for cars or self vehicles, and also industrial feedstock, and also maybe on the aviation side. And then what our finding based on our analysis, at least we analyzed 3 findings. The first findings that we would like to highlight it is on the hydrogen for power storage. If we can see here, this is the graph of the LCOA of renewable energy storage comparison in ASEAN context. We try to analyze or to compare different technologies, including the pump hydro, lithium battery, and also hydrogens itself, which is from hydrogen plus fuel cell, and also hydrogen plus with the gas turbine. If you can see here that the blue bar here is the hydrogen with the fuel cells, and then gray bar here is the centralized hydrogen plus gas turbines. And then for the yellow bar is the lithium battery, and the light blue is the pump hydro. If you can see here in general that the cost of hydrogen for power storage is way higher compared to the battery and also pump hydro in all ASEAN member states. So it can be said that the cost of hydrogen for power storage is way higher compared to the other technologies. And based on our analysis, it average that the cost for hydrogen plus fuel cell, the cost is around $1.47 per kilowatts, and it is followed by the hydrogen plus gas turbine, which is the cost is around $0.50 per kilowatts. But for the lithium battery and the pump hydro is much lower than that. With the lithium battery, the cost is only around 42 cents per kilowatt, and the pump hydro is only 32 cents per kilowatt hour. Next slide. The next one, what our findings on the hydrogen application for transportations is that you can see here that we also do the analysis of how will be the total cost of ownership of bus and trucks in ASEAN using the hydrogen itself. If you can see here, there are 2 different graphs. The first one is for a bus, and the other one is for trucks. And if you see here for bus itself, that the gray bar is the gray hydrogens, the blue bar is the blue hydrogens, the green one is the green hydrogens, and then for the yellow one is the battery electric vehicles, and for the orange one is the PHEV, and the black one is the ICF, internal combustion engine vehicles. For bus, what we can see here that whole of type of the hydrogens in the total cost of ownership of bus is much higher than any type of another vehicles. But for trucks, what we see here that the battery electric vehicle for truck is much or slightly higher than any type of the hydrogens. We see it is because the battery electric vehicle for truck is very heavy and needs more installation of EV in bus itself. So it is expected that the cost installation for battery to be installed in truck is much higher than the bus one. So what we can see here that hydrogen application for bus and truck is not economically attractive yet. It is around 3 times higher of the hydrogen vehicle price than the current diesel for bus and trucks. So that's why at that moment that the hydrogen application for bus and truck is not competitive yet compared to the diesel bus and trucks. Lastly, on our findings on the hydrogen for export market, here our analysis. If we take a look at the graph here in 2020, that the global hydrogen cost is around $5 per kilograms in the red line here. And then what we can see here that in average that any type of hydrogen ranging from the gray hydrogens, blue hydrogens, and green hydrogen in several as a member state, in particular at member state, it's still exceeding the global cost, but it is only with Brunei and Indonesia on the green hydrogens. It's slightly lower than the global cost average. Brunei and Indonesia could produce the green hydrogen at lowest cost, around $5 per kilogram among other member states, because the two countries have abundant reserve of fossil fuel, in particular for natural gas. So based on this, it seems that those two countries are able to implement the green hydrogen as the early stage of the hydrogen developments. And then saying that the cost that can the cost of green hydrogen that can be produced either in Brunei and Indonesia, it seems could be considered quite attractive for Japan market, because the gasoline price per gallon in Japan is around $6.2, and the diesel is around $5 after tax. So that's why green hydrogens could be technology that can be developed in either the Brunei, Indonesia, and can be transported to the Japan market, where it is can be competitive with the gasoline price in Japan markets. And then what we see in the future outlook of the hydrogens, we also doing some calculations. If we consider if the cost of renewable electricity by 2030 is decreasing roughly by 70% with the capex of 50%, that we see that the green hydrogen price could be reduced by 49% from average $10 per kilogram to $5 per kilogram in asset years.
Just a reminder, Mohammed,
Yeah.
already. Yeah, if
Yeah.
you can wrap up.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, and this is what the current updates that we are collected about the hydrogen. For example, in Indonesia, the Pertamina, the oil and gas state-owned oil and gas company, is considering to produce the hydrogens from the geothermal in Sumatra. And also Brunei Darussalam has exported the first hydrogen to Japan in 2022. And then what our analysis recommendation from our study. First, as the initial phase of the hydrogen developments, that between 2021 and 2025, that the ASEAN could produce the gray hydrogens, because the natural gas is abundant, in particular for Brunei and Indonesia. And for the phase 2, 2025 to 2023, the blue hydrogen could be considered, because currently there are some research and deployment of the CCS. And for the long term, 2030 onward, the phase 3, which is the green hydrogen, could be considered as a long-term strategies to be implemented in ASEAN regions. I think that's from my side.
Well, thank you very much, Mohammed, and thanks for highlighting that there is indeed a growing ambitions for the hydrogen production and use in Southeast Asia. But one thing that you highlighted on is that because of the cost, still the hydrogen is not commercially viable, and this is goes back to the point highlighted by David earlier. Now, I would like to move the floor to Dr. Abdullah, and I would like to ask you if you can give an overview of the hydrogen development in the Gulf. As we know, the Gulf Arab states, according to the statistics on the oil and gas reserves, these countries are still will be able to access the oil and gas for the next, like 20 or 80 years ahead. However, the Gulf countries have, joined the race of the net zero, 5 countries in the region have committed to net zero emissions, and we have seen there's a growing interest in developing the hydrogen. I will give the floor to you, and I would like to hear more from you and see if the hydrogen is more of a hype than an opportunity in the Gulf.
Thanks, Dr. Aisha, and thanks. And thanks to NUS for the invite. It's great to be here among the distinguished panelists speaking about this interesting subject at this interesting time. So before I deep dive into the Gulf states and what the Gulf states are doing, I just would like to remind all of us on few key points that, you know, we all are sitting today on kind of an interesting dilemma of having and expecting for the energy demand to be growing globally. So the energy demand will be growing for greater energy access, industrialization, economic growth, and so on. So that will be growing. Now we could argue on the mix, but that's a different subject. Now, while that is growing, there's also a growing expectations that countries should be meeting their net zeros. Yes, so in many ways going clean. Now, a lot of reports are published, and certainly from the International Energy Agency, we continue to publish things on sectoral level, but also on macroeconomic levels and policies. But if I can sum this up, I think that global demand will be met in a decarbonized way through two ways. So electrons will pay roughly half of, or will roughly answer half of the equation, and the green or low emission molecules will answer the second half. So molecules will still be needed, and this is where the clean hydrogen will be playing a big part. Now, coming back to the Gulf, there is a broader context that the Gulf states are so much centric around oil and gas. They've known this for decades, and the whole economy in many ways is built around energy. So it's just a default option for them to continue to exploit new vectors in the energy space. Now, if I could remind all of us, what the Gulf states have done over the past decades in oil and gas, because this is so much, I feel important, for us to keep in mind. The Gulf states have started to exploit the conventional resources from oil and gas through the primary technologies. So, putting holes in the ground and then few pumps, and then we get the oil from the ground. But then they moved slowly into the secondary technologies and then to the tertiary enhanced oil recovery technologies. So that's already in the blood and the DNA of the business here in the Gulf states. At some point in time, and this is roughly about 25 years ago, the states have started to look into what could be the new vectors for oil and gas and could support the economic engines in the regions. And that's when they've started to look into the LNG, and they were some of the pioneering LNG facilities in the Gulf states globally, although the business cases, if we all go back in time 25 years ago, we would have seen a lot more uncertainties in the development of LNG then and the LNG markets. And then obviously the economic condition in the Gulf states that the to continue answering the question is how can we leverage more value out of this oil and gas? They've started to focus on the downstream. That's why we see a lot of downstream industries in the Gulf states. So there is a big supply from this part of the world, but also there is energy intensive industries that the Gulf states need to continue powering. Now, all of this is the oil and gas, and obviously extending the value of oil and gas to LNG and the downstream. But let's not also forget that the Gulf states are already producing sizable quantities of gray hydrogen today. Now, Oman and Saudi particularly, they produce around 1 million tons of gray hydrogen annually. And this is by far a very sizable production quantity. The whole EU, for example, produces 12 million tons of hydrogen today, roughly. So there is already, hydrogen is not new to the region. And if I can latch on to the slide the last time that was given by Dr. Mohammed, having that gray hydrogen knowledge and expertise, it just allows and gives the Gulf states put them into advantageous position to start leveraging and building on to the low emission hydrogen, whether it's blue or green. So that's one important point to keep in mind. There's also the industrial ports. Industrial ports plays a big part in the kind of promotion and the expeditation of this low emission hydrogen, because the ports are now, they're exporting ammonia, they're exporting methanol, they're exporting chemicals, wherein the hydrogen is already a component in. So that infrastructure in the port is already there, and the global trading system. So the Gulf states have already, they're already exporting, and from my expertise, they're already exporting to all the continents in the world. One important factor that stimulates the Gulf states to really also move into the low emission hydrogen is that there is various interlinkages with the legacy oil and gas. And here I can state a few of them, but the pipelines, I've talked about the storage facilities, I've talked about the oil reservoirs that they can be used for CO2 storage, but also there is the produced water. The produced water that comes with oil and gas that can be made for green hydrogen. Currently, companies they are paying millions of dollars to manage that produced water, and if that produced water, with the technology and solution integration opportunities, can be used as a feedstock for green hydrogen, it just makes the whole thing a lot easier and the whole thing a lot more economical viable, economically making more sense. The last point why the Gulf states are also so excited to jump into the low emission hydrogen is the competitive soft costs. There's the soft costs in the region sit around 20% of the overall costs of the projects, and soft costs are the non-technical costs. They're related to the permits, they're limited to the site preparations and so on. So they sit at around 20% of the overall cost of projects in some other parts of the world, and they are at the lowest side of the soft cost globally. Some countries have soft costs, they're going all the way to 50% or 60% of the overall cost of projects. So that's also put them advantages to really move into the low emission hydrogen. Now, given all of this spectrum and all of that mentality, where the Gulf states sit today, as I said in the beginning, they're already in the game. They're already producing gray hydrogen. So hydrogen is not new to the Gulf states, whether in the production side, but also in the downstream side. So converting the hydrogen into some products like ammonia and methanol and exporting them. Also using the gray hydrogen in the refineries here in the Gulf. So there is a lot of focus now to switch the current gray hydrogen into low emission hydrogen.
Is that hydrogen production in the Gulf is not something new. Gray hydrogen has been already produced in the Gulf, and then there's the potential for transferring the existing expertise to something else, which is the production of the green and the blue hydrogen in the region. I would like to follow up with the questions for you, Dr. David. As we have seen that the most of the hype today towards the hydrogen is focusing on the hydrogen production. However, as I mentioned in the introduction, the hydrogen is not a traded commodity, not yet as of today. And so basically that means there's no demand for the clean hydrogen today. What are the challenges there? How we can increase that demands, and what are the measures that can be implemented to increase that demand?
I should maybe, before I begin, I noticed that Abdullah is back with us in the room. Do we want to just pass it back to Abdullah first?
Okay. Hello, Dr. Abdullah. Is everything okay?
Yeah, sorry, I was just cut out by the program for some reason. So if you allow me, I'll finish quick on the point that I was trying to make. So the target that the GCC states are now focusing on is to switch the current demand for gray hydrogen to a low emission hydrogen, and obviously exploit and explore opportunities for cross-border trade. And that continues to be the focus. Now they've set targets for that, and we've seen some of the targets that were announced. They are consolidating the domestic demand, and one of them is switching, and obviously the hard-to-abate industries. And the third one is building the alliances globally. So building the alliances for accreditation, certification, plus also investments and markets. One interesting aspect that I personally I'm personally excited about and have been so much involved in is evaluating the repurposability of some of the skills and supply chains from oil and gas to the energy transition, and obviously the low emission hydrogen. And we've done a lot of evaluation, and we see a good prospect for repurposing some of those capabilities, including, as I said in the beginning, some of the pipelines, storage facilities, some of the skills that can be repurposed to really serve the low emission hydrogen. That will allow the low emission hydrogen to develop in a more competitive way and in an expedited way. The third point that I wanted to make is that the Gulf states are also moving to create sustainability centers. Sustainability centers wherein the low emission hydrogen should be playing a key role in moving those Gulf states to a net zero by 2050 or 2060. Because of the setup and the economic structure of the Gulf states, hydrogen needs to be in the game. As I said, they're already producing the gray hydrogen. So it's a difficult question whether we call it a hype or a hope or a reality. But I think it's part of the business development curve. And that's why I mentioned, for example, the LNG that was developed 25 years ago, and I've seen myself the business cases that were made and the uncertainties that were attached to it. And I was a project manager in the oil and gas company, so I've seen the economics for the EOR and some of the really expensive EOR projects, but they are reality now. So I think it's a necessary hype in a way, but also moving into a reality in the coming few years. And I close with that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Abdullah. As you highlighted, there is a lot of potential advantages for the Gulf countries, despite the high oil and gas reserves and wealth. The expertise is there. It can be transferable to the new sector, the hydrogen production, because gray hydrogen has been already produced in the region. And actually, throughout my reading, we learned that for NEOM, which has the financial close a few weeks ago, it suggests that the project will start operating in 2026. And Oman also announced, like for the first hydrogen, the production will start in 2028, if I'm not mistaken. Sure. This is a short period of time. It is like within the next 3 or 6 years. If you can please, because of your expertise in the region, and you are pretty much closely working with the stakeholders there, can you please highlight on the key challenges that face the hydrogen production and the export in the region? To put it in a simple words, how we can translate those ambitions into a reality.
Thanks, Dr. Aisha. The challenges are, first one is a unified global definition of low emission hydrogen, whether it's blue or green, and the certification schemes that goes along with it. We've been, and I personally was so much involved in some of the discussions in engaging with international stakeholders on how do we define blue? If we capture the CO2 and put it into the underground for EOR, can that be defined as blue hydrogen? Some of the countries are saying no, we might not consider that as blue. It should be kept for storage. So that the definitions are yet, are one of the focus areas that needs to be developed to kickstart this international cross-border trade. And I think that's taking shape. That's taking really good shape. The second challenge is the cost of production, and I think it was highlighted. Cost of production is still high or higher for the blue and green hydrogen for the definitions of the technology. Yeah, so because the blue requires the same setup plus extra equipment, so that's cost. So the higher cost of technology, but then given the announcements and given the time frame, 2027, 2028, or 2029, the technology should be in the, the projects should be in the money. The projects should be resonating and making economical sense. And when we speak about 2028 or so, they are just in the, tomorrow, as we call it. A usual oil and gas project takes around 7 to 8 years to develop. So this is pretty much standard. If projects are sanctioned today and reaching the financial closure today, they're expected to come on stream by 2027 or 2028. So I think the growth is there. So that's the second challenge, is the technology reduction. I think it's in line now with the technology maturation. The third one is setting the right policies for some of the sectors or some of the countries in the GCC. So setting the right investor-oriented policies that stimulate this growth for low emission hydrogen, whether for the domestic utilization or for the export. So, the challenges to me are three. One related to the international trade with its certification and unified definition. The second is on the technology, and the third one is on the domestic side. So setting the regulations and the legal frameworks. Yeah, but given the announced targets, Oman has announced a target of 1 million tons of green hydrogen by 2030. The announced projects will already produce 1.8. So even if one of the projects slip down or slip out, still the target will be achieved. And so that's the kind of the level of confidence that we're talking about on the green and low emission hydrogen.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdullah. Also, for the sake of comparison, I want to go back to you, Mohammed. You mentioned the cost very clearly as one of the obstacles for the hydrogen, scale up in Southeast Asia. Have you also, given that you are involved with the ASEAN Center for Energy, are there also other key challenges that will stand in the face of the hydrogen production and use in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, what we see here in Southeast Asia, another challenge is besides the cost of hydrogen itself, what we see here, the lack of hydrogen infrastructure in Southeast Asia, such as the pipeline or liquefaction plants and others. So once the technology is there, maybe we know how to produce the gray hydrogen, but then other infrastructure is already enough in Southeast Asia. And then another challenge is that we also see here that lack of market due to still the high price of the hydrogens. The current market that we see is only for example is Japan and South Korea, because they are closely with Southeast Asia. But also we need to also pick out what are the bigger market other than that to unlock the potential of the hydrogen market itself. And then the other challenges that we also in discussion with several experts is on the safety of the hydrogen itself. A safety concern is one of the finding that we found, in particularly for the public itself. So such as the gas explosions or the gas leakage. So that's why this is like the another challenge that we see in Southeast Asia.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. David, if I can come back to you again. Yeah, I asked earlier, there is no demand for the clean hydrogen at the moment, despite this growing enthusiasm towards the hydrogen. Abdullah and Muhammad highlighted clearly because for some there are issues with the definition of the hydrogen, the certification schemes. Do you also think that there are other enablers that can, enhance the hydrogen demand globally?
Yeah, I think we're all singing the same song, and probably you're going to hear a lot of this. I'm not so sure that we can really qualify this as a market with no demand. I think we can certainly qualify this as a market with unrealized demand and questions around whether or not that demand could or should be realized. And I think it's useful potentially to think of things in that context, because I think there's so much momentum and discussion that it's obviously a technology which is being given a great deal of seriousness, not just within this region, but globally. There's a lot of work being done in Japan, Australia, America, and other places to facilitate the expansion of these markets. And the key point here is that it's not a market for hydrogen that's absent. There's a market for hydrogen today already. And that market is for hydrogen as a commodity in and of itself. But what we're talking about is the market for hydrogen as a source of fuel. And, I think Abdullah made this point very eloquently, that actually, as of today, there's not necessarily a rich enough environment in terms of the regulations and standards to permit that use for hydrogen as a fuel, to give those market participants confidence that they're ready to proceed to the next level of investment with the technologies. And then on top of this, you've got the price uncertainty. And the price uncertainty is a combination of both supply and demand factors. But, I think there's an interesting question, which I think you were leaning towards a bit earlier, which is, well, is there maybe another layer of consideration which needs to be moved forward, which is regarding the commoditization of hydrogen with a view to it being a fuel? And this, I think, is actually another question which I'm not going to attempt to answer, but I believe it is a very important question. Because if we're to make that transition, then we probably also need to realize that traditional fuel sources, I think, quite naturally fall into a way of thinking that hydrogen is just an extension of natural gas. Now, I know the chemists and engineers in the room will tell me that I'm making a very brave assumption there, but in many ways, we can see that connection, because in the very first instance, you're just using it to complement the natural gas supply chain. You're just injecting, you're blending. And so there are connections between these markets, parallels which are important. And then what we know about things like natural gas and oil is that commercialization or commoditization has coupled with the creation of futures markets in addition to spots markets, and trustworthy mechanisms to allow everybody purchasing along the supply chain and everybody supplying along the supply chain to be confident about the flows of money that are moving forward years in advance, so that the whole market can stabilize and calibrate. Now, I'm not sure there's yet enough of a discussion around what happens to the commercialization of hydrogen with respect to it being a market that is no longer just for the commodity, but also for the role it plays within the fuel. And again, I caution my wording there with, we already trade hydrogen as a physical commodity. We use it in various different ways. And so there's something different which needs to emerge in order for it to be working as a fuel. And so, I like I say, I think really I'm singing the same song as those messages presented by Mohammed and Abdullah, but we need to see a couple of things move together. But I think we are, and I'll maybe offer my sort of closing position. I think we are in a marketplace where there's an effort to realize the value proposition, that there's opportunity which we know is potentially there, and that opportunity places more importance over discussions at the moment than the hype which has now been and gone. The hype is in some ways receded, and there's a realization that we're in a marketplace that is on a cusp. And there's a very important signal presented by more than one economy that there will be efforts to create a physical marketplace, an actual production of energy from hydrogen-based sources as clean and green as possible, preferably green all the way. And then we'll maybe worry about the other marketization components later, because particularly at this point in time, energy security places such a high value upon all of our considerations that we just haven't been presented with in recent years. So there's my thoughts.
Well, thank you very much, David. So I don't want to monopolize the discussion. So I want to open the floor for the questions. So please, anyone, if you have question, please feel free to write it directly to the chat box to MEI event or to myself. At the moment, I have one question from Georgi Bustin, who is a visiting fellow at the Middle East Institute. And I believe this question is to Dr. Abdullah. He's saying, based on their advanced start position, will the Gulf states preserve their advantage as key energy suppliers in the hydrogen as well, being a global bomb?
Thank you for the question. I think it's a big one. I would be inclined to say that the Gulf states would love to be part of that low emission energy production and trading. Some of the countries are trying to be pioneers, so ahead of the curve in terms of supply. But I think it's still too early to say whether they can be pioneers, because renewables, they're available everywhere, and the policymakers are really aware of this. So renewables of some sort, whether it's the hydro or the thermal or the biomass. So the renewables are not only limited to the GCC. The GCC, I think, is blessed so much with renewables, with solar and wind, and the integration of those. Maybe they can exploit the thermal and the sea. So will they want to dominate? I think it's still too early to answer the question, but certainly they want to be part of that game. Not for any reason, but there is a natural fit with the economic structure that's already taking place in the country and in the region.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Abdullah. I have a technical question, and I believe this is to Muhammad. The question is, what is the duration of storage for the renewable energy storage compared to the hydrogen with the battery? Is it 30 days or?
Yeah, based on our analysis, is around 30 days, but we don't do any in-depth analysis on how much it is exactly, but it is around 30 days.
All right, so I'm still waiting for questions. Anyone, please feel free to post your questions. And while we are waiting for that, I do have a question myself. Now we see that hydrogen is an opportunity for almost any country to take a role in producing the hydrogen, because almost every country has one source of another of renewable energy. So my question is, are we going to see more of a cooperation or competition between countries when it comes to the hydrogen? And will the hydrogen alter the geopolitical energy map that we see today, or is going to perpetuate the current geopolitical energy map? It is for the three speakers. Please feel free to jump in.
Well, maybe I'll go first, if I may. I actually meant to comment on this a moment ago, because actually one other thing to think about when we consider the creation of the markets, or the stabilization of the markets, maturity is probably the best word. When we think about other energies or fuels like oil and natural gas, there's a geographic concentration which resides behind these. And that creates a certain kind of anchoring that becomes almost natural for the markets in terms of where the organization occurs, the hubs. And this may be very different when it comes to hydrogen, but actually if we extend that, I mean, that by itself presents an interesting dilemma, because you bump into the question of, well, where will the hubs emerge? And if everywhere can potentially be a mini hub, then which one makes more sense than the others? How do you put this market together? Are we talking about like a European gas network type problem? Or are we talking about something else? But I think also there's the added dimension, which is that, well, we realize that many countries have the potential to produce a certain amount of hydrogen within their own borders. And then the question becomes, well, how much and why do you need to trade? And you know, could there be a self-sufficiency question, which begins to play an important role? And again, in the complexity of the energy markets today, with all of the energy security concerns which have been heightened in the past couple of years, that question is surely on some people's minds. One thing, the analog which plays through in my mind right now is that, well, when we had shale gas emerge as a potential source of energy, we had an awful lot of optimism towards, you know, self-generated sources of fuel. And that energy was met with unexpected problems. You know, we had the ground conditions which created potential ground movements and all sorts of problems that resulted in regulations that prohibited the production of energy from extraction of shale gas in certain countries. And this goes back again to Mohammed's question around also the safety considerations which exist in relation to hydrogen, which are there. People are already raising these considerations. So no, I think there's a lot to consider when it comes to that question of the geographic dispersion, but then on top of that, what it could create in terms of a different landscape for the import requirements of different countries.
Thank you very much, David. If anyone wants to, comment on the question, please feel free. Otherwise, I can see questions are coming in the chat. One question is, can LNG serve as a model for hydrogen markets, or might this just be a flawed idea?
If I take that, I think LNG will be a really good reference for hydrogen markets for many reasons. But for one, is that it started on mid to long term contracts, and I think this is much needed now for the hydrogen, because no one will be investing on a very short offtake. So that's one. And two, upon the maturity of the technology and the markets, then it becomes on spot market. So in terms of market design, I think it will more or less follow the same growth. And secondly, it's so much close in terms of properties and export mechanisms to LNG, more so than oil. So I think, yes, it'll be one of the very good references to benchmark and learn from LNG.
That's great. Thank you, Dr. Abdullah. Another question from John Sok from Energy Studies Institute. He's asking, which of the hard to decarbonize sectors do you think hydrogen can be the best alternative?
In the cases that we've seen here in Oman and the GCC, we see the steel is certainly one of the very hard to abate sectors that hydrogen is a very good fit. And that's why, for example, some of the big companies here in Oman, Jindal Shadid, is now moving into that. The second one is obviously the ammonia loops that are produced that are taking so much energy to produce the ammonia. So that those ammonia loops operate in very high temperatures, so they can be powered by green hydrogen, and a few other industries like the aluminum and the glass. They're also they could also be relying on hydrogen. So that's what we're considering in Oman, and certainly have been engaging with some of the stakeholders in the region, and that's the mentality. That's what I can say.
Okay, thank you very much. A question for David, and this one is from Asif Shuja, who is a fellow at the Middle East Institute. He's asking, why are the big oil companies lobbying for hydrogen fuel production? Are there any push from them to promote more of blue hydrogen than green hydrogen? Maybe the question is this valid or?
I mean, this is a complicated question. One could take many positions on this, but I mean, let's go with a simple rational conclusion that may or may not hold, but is certainly worth remembering. So one intermediate solution is actually, if we take Singapore as the context, and my context has been fairly narrow-minded, but the context here is that we have an existing supply chain, a fuel mix, which requires the use of natural gas. And in the very, very, very near term, we can take hydrogen and we can blend it into the fuel mix, and we can slightly decarbonize our power generation. Now, it won't be a total decarbonization by doing that, assuming it's all green hydrogen, by the way. It won't be a total decarbonization by doing that, but it's a fairly quick win. And this is, one place where there are natural synergies between the emerging hydrogen supply chain and the existing hydrocarbon use of fuels to generate power for the economy. And then if we go to the question of, would an oil company or a company that produces natural gas see wisdom in trying to help facilitate that market process, which will extend the potential lifetime of what will become stranded assets if they don't use the oil and gas? Then one can very obviously land on a conclusion that, well, they wouldn't be against it, for sure. Now, questions of lobbying, I'll steer clear of. I don't know that I know enough or want to know enough about precisely how the markets are being lobbied. This is a very different type of question. But what I would say is this, that certainly big oil companies, as we might choose to refer to them, that they have a complicated situation that they need to work through. Now, one thing which is ultimately true, unambiguously true, is that none of these companies wish to end. They don't wish to come to a cessation in their operations. In the very long run, they have every aspiration to be in existence. And to achieve that will not be a 100-year business model built on oil and gas. It has to be something different. So really, it's a question of what is the roles that these companies can play to appease their stakeholders in terms of sustaining the potential value of the assets which they currently retain, versus making the transition to the alternative in a way which is pleasing to as many parties as possible. And there's obviously going to be many conflicts in that process. So I'm kind of navigating around the question by trying to not place a view on the lobbying side of things, but there's natural market dynamics which are quite important, and it's important to step back and truly appreciate the powerful forces which exist behind those and the long run outcomes which these companies themselves will be very much aware of in making their strategic decisions around how to operate today.
Thank you very much, David. And I do agree with that. Company cannot be not making a profit overnight. They should navigate through the process of the energy transition. I have another question from Clemens, who is also a fellow in the Middle East Institute. So Clemens says that Saudi Arabia has, through the recent visits by the Crown Prince to Asia, namely to Thailand, South Korea, and currently to Japan, secured investment deals on boosting the hydrogen economy. What is exactly there for Asian parties? What is the value in these agreements? Is it more of a technology, know-how, storage hubs, or is there anything else? I think this question can go to Abdullah or Mohammed.
Maybe Mohammed, you want to go first?
You might go first, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So from the perspective of the GCC countries, having that partnership and collaboration, I think it's part of developing new growths. So all countries are looking for new partners, new investments. That partnership will take up many forms. For one is investment, technology, supply chains, expertise sharing, but also extend all the way to the offtake. So that's from a GCC perspective. Now, what's in it for the other Asian countries? I think it's that energy security that Dr. David was referring to. I think it's really important to keep all the engines and all the economy running smoothly. So securing various types of energy, whether it's the conventional oil and gas, or the decarbonized oil and gas, or the new energies like hydrogen, is so important to the importing nations. So that's one advantage. The secondly is keeping a foot in the production of technologies and supply chains, similar to the historical trend in the oil and gas. A lot of those nations are industrial by definition, so they want to really transition as quickly as possible so they can have that leading edge in exporting and manufacturing. And thirdly, I think it's the joint investment. In investment, they have a lot of value for both the importing and exporting nations, and collectively, the three reasons, I think it reinforces some of the discussion that I was referring to your previous question on the reorientation of the global geoeconomics. And I think that's true to some ways. I think the global geoeconomics is much beyond energy, if you ask me, but it's so much rests on a fully functioning energy partnership. So that geopolitics, I think, is reshaping, and that serves this macroeconomic objective.
Yeah, from ASEAN or Southeast Asia, then we see that the hydrogen with the Gulf country is not become the competitor or challenges, but in contrast, it will be an opportunity to building the operations. As mentioned by Abdullah, I agree that it will be maybe like the similar case of oil and gas. Initially, that a lot of oil and gas cooperation between like Southeast Asia, in particular for Indonesia and Malaysia, which are the higher producer of oil and gas, and we are also learning and being collaboration with the Gulf countries. This also will be the similar case for Southeast Asia. Like I mentioned before, that we are still a lot of challenges in the hydrogen productions, such as in the gray hydrogen production from natural gas, and also there the issue on the safety. Then where we see that these challenges could be solved by learning from another experience, particularly from the Gulf countries. For example, since the application of gray hydrogen is still in early developments, in particular in Indonesia. So that's why a lot of experts should be developed, a lot of technicians should be developed. So maybe one of strategies to improve the capacity or the knowledge of the expert in Indonesia or in Southeast Asia countries is to learn from the Gulf countries on how they are working on the green hydrogen from natural gas. So this is what we see as the potential collaborations. So that's why we see that it is more on the opportunity rather than the challenge or the competitions.
Great, thank you, Mohammed. There are still more questions on the chat box, but I also want to, one aspect that we didn't talk about is the finance of the hydrogen projects. Is it really of a challenge to allocate the finance for the hydrogen projects from the Southeast Asia perspective and from the Gulf perspective?
If I give my take on this, I think the financing and investments, the world is not short of money. There is a lot of money floating. The challenge is on the market structure. And if I could simplify this, is that the producers, like the Gulf states, they are inclined to make it more on an off-taker pay model, whereby the off-taker takes a bigger share of the risk, whereby some of the markets are trying to use the gas station model, whereby you produce the low emission hydrogen, get it to my door, and then if I want, I'll buy. If not, then and this is my demand. So it's still the market dynamics are still shaping up, and this is I would say very natural. Once I think the agreement is there on which model the world is going through, and I think this should be, with the current signings and the movement and the focus on the low emissions, I think that will be kind of addressed in the next few months or so. Once that market model and business model is agreed upon, I think the flow of the money should have no problem. I think there's huge money waiting for technologies and markets to develop.
Yeah, and Oman maybe can, and Saudi Arabia as well, can give an example for that in terms of like joint ventures and also the partnership with the other countries to develop the hydrogen.
Indeed. So some of the strategies that some of the GCC countries are doing, and I'm speaking of awareness from Oman, for example, is to start producing products for a start, because products have less uncertainties. I'm saying here, for example, green steel, less uncertainties than fuels for export. So, let's wait for the global definitions to be developed, but the definitions for green steel, I think they're already there. So that's one strategy that Oman is taking. The second one is trying to consolidate the demand in the domestic markets, because that will allow the supply chains, the orientation of the markets domestically to shape up, reduce the soft costs that I was talking about to a really competitive way, leverage upon the current infrastructure, and when the roller coaster for the cross-border trade comes in, then the whole thing is set up. So those are some of the tactics that the governments over here are trying to do. Plus, of course, establishing the frameworks and the policies and the legalities that will assure the investors on the markets.
Okay, great. So we are 3 minutes to closing this session today. I want to conclude with one question for the three of you. Are you optimistic in seeing the hydrogen production and export becoming a reality in the near future?
I can maybe go first. So I think I've already expressed a cautious optimism. I think there's a pragmatic question around what are the other alternatives, which at the moment mean that we will continue to see additional momentum, additional investment. I'm cautious in that I think markets need testing before we make the firm commitment. But it seems like we're willing to be doing those tests, and not just hypothetically, but governments are making the commitment to actually properly test bed. And absent of another alternative emerging within the near term, I think in 20 years from now, we'll be looking at a market which has a sizable proportion of hydrogen and material, let's say a material market scale, but I may be wrong.
Thank you, David. Mohammed?
Yeah, from our perspective, it is very, very positive, because it is like the new technology coming in. Like, for example, like when we first introduced like the solar PV, wind turbine, that the cost is very, very high. But then since the market is there, and then we need to move to the energy of carbon, so that's why we think that we are pessimistic that in the future that hydrogen will be considered as the new technology that will help the countries to achieve the net zero.
Thank you, Mohammed. Dr. Abdullah?
I think, hydrogen has made false startups in the past few decades. So it was trying to, come in the game and then disappear for one reason or another. But what I can say is that this is very natural in any technology. We've seen it in the PV cells. We've seen it in the combustion engines to produce power. We've seen it in some of the ER technologies. Yes, I agree with the speakers, Dr. David and Mohammed, that the market dynamics are, still require some maturation. But I'm very optimistic that the hydrogen will pick up.
Okay. So with that, it is 5:30 my time, and we are coming to the end of this session. Thank you very much for the three speakers for a productive and fruitful discussion. I indeed learned a lot today, and thanks to everyone who is joining us in this webinar. And with that, I wish you all a happy afternoon or evening, and thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Excellency. Thanks to the speakers.
Thank you.